Breaking Barriers, an RAF engineer's journey. In this episode of Once a Warrior, Life Beyond the Uniform, we speak with a female veteran who served as an engineering officer in the RAF. Jen Robinson, now deeply involved in an ex-serving and serving women's network in Northern Ireland, and currently working with Ashes to Gold. She continues to inspire and support others through her work. We explore her journey through the military service, leadership, and her mission beyond the uniform. Welcome to this edition of Once a Warrior, Life Beyond the Uniform. My name is David Johnson. I'm the Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland. And this podcast is to allow veterans to tell their story, what it was like to be in uniform, and then what it was like transitioning after they served. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Jen Robinson, and she is an ex-RAF engineering officer. Jen, absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining the podcast. Are you looking forward to today?
Oh, definitely.
Can't wait, I'm sure. Can't wait. So really looking forward to hearing your story and your journey. So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born? Anything about your early life that stands out?
Okay, I was born in Belfast. While my mum was in hospital having me, my dad was trying to find them somewhere to live because you weren't allowed to have children in the flat that they had.
Okay.
So we started off in Craigavon and then moved to Portadown. And there's me, and I have a younger brother, about a year younger than me. And yeah, went to Portadown College. I always enjoyed adventure as opposed to maybe team sports. My brother would have been a bit more team sports and I'm a hockey man. I'd have been a bit more kind of what was the next adventurous training. And that, I guess, is probably part of the reason that the Air Cadets appealed to me so much then when I went to Portadown College. And that would have been the beginning of my journey towards the Royal Air Force.
Okay. Anything stand out in sort of school life, early life, just in terms of any childhood memories?
I suppose where I would still too have a love of the outdoors, and I always remember very fondly spending time, we were kicked out of the house in the morning and brought back in again to be fed at some appropriate point later on in the day. And building dens and lifting frogs and kind of being doing the outdoor nature thing. Yeah,
I can remember a bit of that when I was younger. Particularly in the summer holidays, it was like out the door in the morning and come back for tea. Life was simpler in those days.
100%,
and yet more enjoyable.
No social media to worry about.
No iPads and all that. You say social media, which that's another discussion for another day.
Yeah, for sure.
How that impacts the younger generation. But a wee birdie tells me that when you were a certain age, rather than having posters of maybe pop groups and stuff on the wall, what posters did you have on the wall?
I like to have an odd picture of an airplane.
An airplane. So your room was decorated with different,
particularly
different
fast jets. Tornado F3 GR4.
And where did that fascination come from?
I think airplanes would always have been a thing in our family. My dad was an aircraft engineer way back.
Okay.
So he worked at the maintenance unit at Aldergrove doing depth maintenance on Phantoms.
Okay.
So it was probably always talked about. And I would have always been interested in how things worked. And aircraft are to me, the ultimate in how things work, because they fly.
They fly, okay. And you then went into the Air Cadets you mentioned. And so that gave you a chance to get in amongst it a little bit and start to be in uniform, inverted commas. And did you enjoy that experience?
I did, and I think the thing I really enjoyed about the Air Cadets was the opportunity to do different things, to go flying, to do a parachute jumping, to go and visit different RAF stations in England, to go and do some work experience on a Wessex at Aldergrove, to do all of those kind of different things. Was the bit that appealed to me for sure. And at the same time, still all the other bits too, going and doing your cross-country running, going on different cadet experiences and explorations.
And did you come across other sort of I don't know if they're called detachments or what are they referred to in different locations?
Squadrons,
Different squadrons,
yeah, other
okay.
ATC,
So you would have competed
yeah.
in different competitions?
Yeah, for sure,
okay,
yeah, and done things together. And I still know a couple of people from Air Cadet days who then, like me, joined the Air Force.
Yeah, well, I'm aware that Rachel Harger, who obviously works in the Veterans Commissioner's office, was also in the Air Cadets, I believe around the same time as you. So I'm not sure if ever you're on a cross-country run and one of your opponents elbowed you off the track. That may well have been Rachel, I don't know. Rumour has it, but it's
for sure.
highly possible. She is very competitive, to be fair, very competitive.
I'm not, I'm quite mild-mannered, so you'll be all right.
Oh, that's okay. Well, so then, when the time came, so what did you study? What was your sort of career path education-wise?
Yeah, so I inquired about joining the Air Force then when I was 16 as an aircraft engineer, and was advised by the careers office to go back to school, finish my A-levels and apply for sponsorship through university instead and go down the engineer officer route, which is what I did. I was sponsored through university. I went to the University of Salford, studied aeronautical engineering, was a member of Manchester and Salford University Air Squadron, so continued that kind of theme through, and went from there. Not only, I suppose too, with the University Air Squadron, and it's that lifestyle thing again that was a big part of the appeal. That was when I first ever got to try skiing, first ever time, which it wasn't for me, but also got introduced to offshore sailing, which was for me, and we went on and did quite a bit of that in the early days of being in the Air Force.
So you then decided as a career path to join the RAF. So what was the thought process around that? Did you have other options, or were you just convinced this was the pathway for you?
No, I was pretty fixed. Yeah, I knew this was the pathway for me. Right. Yeah, like I said, I tried to join when I was 16, and then so I shouldn't have said that. Sure, I shouldn't have. But when I was 16,
you had an aspiration to join when you were 16.
I had an aspiration when I was 16, and then being sponsored by the Air Force through university, it also meant that you didn't have to worry about a job at the end of university. I remember a lot of my peers, doing job interviews while also trying to do finals and dissertations. I didn't have that. So then I graduated, and later on that same year started initial officer training. Yeah,
that's interesting in terms of the sponsorship. So would you recommend that to someone? If someone is convinced that's the route, to go into uniform, you find that being sponsored give you a bit of peace of mind that when you finished your education, you had a job waiting for you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, 100%. And I think, I was sponsored the whole way through, and some of my peers, would have been at different points through university where they applied for their sponsorship and went, but it gave you that, I guess, in some ways, security too. You knew what job you were going into when it came to the end of that studying period. So I'd very much recommend it. And it also gave you that, I suppose, early belonging to... because you've got your University Air Squadron, and I guess for the other services, their equivalent that you're a member of, and becomes quite a big part of your university experience. Yeah,
I suppose then when you finish that education phase, you're also integrated already to a certain point.
Yeah, 100%. Well, you already know some of the language, and you know how to put the uniform on, I guess, to start. You know how to
Which is a great starting point. I can still remember the first time wondering how do those soldiers keep their trousers looking so nice and prim over the top of the combat boots, but then you discover there is a method.
You get all the tricks.
There's a method.
There's always a method.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the RAF, I suppose, like most of the different service arms, probably male dominated in many ways, changed more recently, but back then, had you any concerns over being a female join what was perhaps perceived to be a very male dominated environment?
No, I didn't. I suppose my experience it didn't ever feel or seem male dominated. Maybe partly because I had friends who we had gone from university into the Air Force together, girlfriends and male friends. And in my early stages in the Air Force too, was where I went on to make some more friends, and that same group are friends of mine now. So I guess having that big-ish group of girlfriends didn't make it seem that way. And I think too, as an engineer, because so much of it, so much of your, I suppose, all the academics and everything that go before it, you've already done so much to get to that point that it didn't feel like competitive in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you have any mentors that you looked up to as you started that journey in the RAF?
Yeah, well, firstly, it would have been my parents, for sure. You know, they would have always given me that, and still do, that go for it. Go and do what you are driven and want to do, but at the same time with that, you know, cushion behind that when not everything goes right first time, when it's not successful, that you have that support to go back. So they would have played a big role in giving me that confidence to go on. And then in my early career, and going through my engineering jobs, particularly ones where I was responsible for people, would have been the warrant officers that I worked with. You know, the mentorship that they would have given me in my very first job. The warrant officers, a gentleman called Bob Sue, and all, you know, he really wanted at the stage he was in his career to have a brand new engineer officer out of the box to impart his wisdom on.
Impart or mould?
Well, and mould, yeah, for sure. So he had a big impact, you know, about how to look after people, how to do right by the team, and at the same time then be able to deliver the operational output that you need to deliver to.
Yeah. So in terms of training and getting into it, there's very often the looks great sometimes on the adverts, and then you're now in the middle of the daily grind. At any point during training or early years, did you think, this is not really what I thought it was going to be, or was it what you expected?
I think in many ways it was what I expected. I can still remember, you know, discovering how you could take 5 minutes sleep at a lunchtime and it actually make a difference to your afternoon when you've got to go on and do the same thing again. I remember there being one point in engineer, getting towards the end probably of training, where I found it difficult, and I remember speaking to home and saying, you know, I'm not sure that I've picked the right career for me, and it being, oh, it's okay, it's not the right thing for you. Pack your bags, we'll come and get you, you know, come home. And that being enough for me to go, no, okay, maybe I've got I've got a bit more left in me, and kind of going back and getting back stuck in.
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be good for you to explain exactly what is an engineering officer. You're speaking here to an infantry officer. So my experience of fast air is usually hearing a sound and then remember to look over here to see the actual aircraft. That's my experience of fast air. So explain what exactly is an engineering officer in the RAF.
So I guess there's different roles that you take on through your career, but on the front line, so whenever I would have been behind the fast air that you'd be used to hearing, be responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft on the squadron that you're a part of, responsible for the engineers who are working on those aircraft, for their professional standards, and also for their well-being, their pastoral care and their career development. And it would do in any of the services too, where it extends out to the family. When we're, work and family lines blur massively in the armed forces. So it is much more than just a job. So having that responsibility for the whole team and building teams and keeping teams going sometimes when things are tough. So I'll be in engineering management side, and then also in other roles it would be in working with industry. I worked at BAE Systems at their Wharton site for a couple of years, looking after an international team of air forces on a particular aircraft, and we worked with industry on the what it looked like whenever we had the airplane versus what they were designing in house, and project management of the delivery of equipment into service.
That's while you were still in the RAF, those roles? So working with sort of private sector industry, bringing your experience and your knowledge to the design.
Probably what I was in the Air Force for 18 and a half years and did 14 different jobs. So, you moved around quite a lot and built that base between operational, supporting aircraft away from home base, being back at home base, and then also in the procurement and the support into service. Yeah.
So what would you say were the main challenges as you were doing that engineer officer role? Let's say maybe not in theatre, just ordinary day to day, anything that springs to mind that just was challenging?
Probably that that rapidness that you change jobs. So you get to the point and you're like, oh, I've nailed this. I know what I'm doing whenever I go in on a Monday morning, back to I haven't got a clue what I'm doing here again. But that was also part of the appeal. I equally thrived in that challenge of continually learning.
Yeah, some people like the stability of just knowing their job.
Absolutely, yeah.
Others like to be challenged, and it brings the best out in them. So I guess what you're saying is that brought the best out in you. You know, you were walking into a new environment, new people, new tasks, and that you found that motivated you. Yeah,
definitely, and still does for sure.
Okay. So in terms of operationally, then, where all have you served operationally?
When I was the senior engineer on 31 Squadron, we did our stint in Afghanistan. I worked in the European Union Force headquarters in Sarajevo in Bosnia. I've done QRA in the Falklands, but now, and NATO QRA in Lithuania, and QRA in the UK, so quick reaction alert whenever I worked on Tornado F3s. Quite a long time ago.
It's a pretty unique CV. I wouldn't think there's too many people that sort of CV. In terms of Afghanistan, and what year roughly Afghanistan?
2011.
11, okay. So things were still pretty hot then. So what was it like being in that environment? Maybe before you headed in, what conversations with the family? Any fear, apprehension at heading into what was a pretty dangerous operational environment?
Oh, we did. The training and how to, obviously part of, for us is it's all about the aircraft. So we would have done the training exercises about what happens if you've got something that happens around the aircraft, and you still need to launch aircraft, and aircraft moving in a flight line's a dangerous place anyway, particularly then when you add weapons to the aircraft. So we would have done a lot of training around that. We would also have done some pastoral care training. Me and my 2 junior engineer officers, the squadron warrant officer and the 2 shift flight sergeants, with the Padre, came and spent a couple of days with us on, how we could look after each other and how we could look after our teams while we were there. And then, we're obviously a part of a squadron, the other element of the squadron being the aircrew. So we would have done quite a bit with them as well, and with the management team of a flying squadron there's the squadron boss, and then you would have an executive officer and the senior engineer, and then you would have another couple of senior aircrew. And we as a team then also looked at how we were going to support the men and women that were taken with us.
In terms of leadership, I'm curious to unpack that a bit. I can recall I went to Iraq in 2004, second in command of an infantry company, and I can remember before going, one of the big questions was, how am I going to cope in a leadership situation? Individual skills is one thing, being able to do the tactics and all of that, but in the leadership role, in that moment when decisions have to be made, the right decisions made under pressure, literally life is at risk if a wrong decision's made. I remember before going, that was something that played a lot in my mind. How am I going to cope in that environment? Had you a similar thought process, or how did you find out there as a leader of people and trying to handle the whole emotion around that?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the decision making as an engineer, because you make airworthiness decisions on an airplane, for many years before that, you're, I don't want to say used to, because there's really important decisions, but that sort of process is practiced, I guess. And then from a leadership of the men and women's perspective, I think for me, it's all about the people. It's about how they communicate, how we communicate with people both ways, what we are talking about or experiencing lands, because it lands differently with different people. Some people will find something quite alarming or quite frightening. Other people will find it, a bit more matter of fact. And then to the response when we were there, I don't think I really realised at the time. It was whenever we were coming to the end that somebody mentioned it, that every time we had a rocket attack, I would have checked first on where it was, where my engineers who were on shift were, where my engineers off shift were, and then we'd look at the airplanes and start to look at what would come next with the journey recovery. But everybody got used to that routine that I had, and it gave some reassurance, I guess, or some felt supported.
And was that something you just did? It was obviously part of your training, but you also just made sure that that was followed. As a post-flight recovery every time an incident took place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's where sort of routine
became a routine. Yeah,
I was about to say,
became my routine. Yeah.
Because that's really what, in many ways, the training in the British military is around. It's routine, repetitive, so that you don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
Emotions taken out of the equation. You just do what you do because that's what you've done.
Yeah, and you save your capacity for whenever you encounter something outside a routine.
Yeah. So any examples of either a big decision you had to make, maybe to ground an aircraft, or a decision that you made and others were disagreeing with you, but you stood your ground? Anything sort of spring to mind?
Yeah, we did quite a bit of work then. You have an airplane, you can... for the engineers working on the airplane can get tasks where they could do self-supervised, where they don't need anybody else there with them. And there's still quite significant tasks on the aircraft. And we were, in that period of time we were in Afghanistan, experienced quite a bit of rocket attacks. Now they were disruptive, more than anything else really, but that's part of the effect, isn't it? But with that disruption, if guys and girls were off shift, they weren't getting the rest, and if they were on shift, things took longer. So we did some work then into fatigue and the soft. So I suppose you could say in that sort of softer side of if there's a risk. In particularly in that context, you don't want a risk of something happening to an aircraft because somebody is too tired. But those conversations can be difficult to have because too tired in an operational environment is it's a difficult thing to talk about, isn't it? It's like, almost wise up. But
it is, and again, speaking from the infantry side,
you understand what I mean,
you're in a firefight on the ground.
You don't have
and you're wanting fast air to potentially save the life of you and your troops. And then sort of it's like, well, fatigue's kicking in or tiredness is kicking in. It's like, hello. But at the same time,
you don't want that aircraft trying to get airborne and not making it off the runway and the consequences of that. So bringing up those discussions and having some of those more, I guess, human factors discussions in an operational environment were hard to have and hard to push through, but I think really important to recognise. And not necessarily just to recognise and to hold it and to take it away from the guy who is working on the airplane. That it's not their decision; it's somebody else's. To hold that risk.
You were comfortable making those decisions in your
and holding those risks
and saying, "I'm making it. It's my call."
You either are or you're not.
Okay. I guess within that environment, what people probably don't think of too much, and maybe it wasn't in your mind too much, but I mean, the cost of some of those aircraft. I don't know. Pick an aircraft you would dealt with. I mean, what sort of cost, if you're allowed to say that, in terms of roughly would one of those aircraft cost?
That would be phenomenal, and it's not just the aircraft, it's then the investment into the two crew in it. Good, their training alone is millions of pounds. So it's a lot.
It's a lot of money,
of investment,
and you're there making a decision. Does this aircraft leave the ground or not? And it's you deal with a lot of money. It's just. It adds to the decision-making process that you have to go into. I'm assuming there was some loss of life on your tour in terms of the general military on the ground. Was there repatriation services on? Were you based in Kandahar? Where were you based?
We were in Kandahar,
Was there any repatriation services there, or maybe they were out in the different?
I think they would have been camps? More from Bastion.
On that front. But I'm sure just being in theatre when the news comes through.
Oh, of course, of course.
It makes it all real.
Of course,
and that, any particular instance come to mind, or?
I think more. I remember at the very end of our time, we had handed over, and we were waiting then to go home. And at that sort of point when we're not working and we're just sort of there, I think that for everybody there was a poignant period of we're on our way home.
I can remember the last task we were given into Basra, and just this look around the room of who's put their hand up. And there was some that were keen to do it, but there were definitely others were like,
I'm this
no,
far.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So, and it's hard to explain until you've been in that scenario where you've finished your tour, you're literally on a flight home, and then just the wondering what's going to happen in this last 3, 4, 5 days.
I remember I was handing over to the senior engineer of the squadron that came in after us, that we had a rocket attack, and we were in where our offices were, on the ground, while there was a radio, BFBS, playing in the background with Who Wants to Live Forever on the radio.
You're like, okay, that was just, perfect timing.
It was perfect timing.
Or not, as the case may be, on that front. Okay, so you then got the decision where you were going to leave the RAF then. What, did something in particular prompt that, or you just decided for career change, or? Yeah,
no, I was in Toronto, just getting ready to finish, close to finishing staff college there, on exchange, and I was involved in a car accident.
Right, okay.
And I decided at that point that I maybe wasn't going to live forever, and I would like to. I spent in those 14 jobs moving around. You know, whether I've never served in Northern Ireland, so it's always been England or overseas. And my parents aren't getting any younger. My nephews are growing up, and my brother and friends, and decided that it would be I had an option point coming up a couple of years later, that if I took the option point, and I would still have the energy and drive to do potentially another career. So I decided to retire at that point. A difficult decision. Because I had a fantastic career in the Royal Air Force, and I loved every minute of it, pretty much. And was.
Did you take advice from people? Who did you speak to about that decision? I'm sure some in the RAF, maybe your family. Yeah. Did you sort of talk to various people, or do you just think, no, I make this decision myself for me?
I pretty much made it myself for me, although I did speak with our career management. I had a job, I was going to Brussels, so I spoke with the general I was going to go and work for there, and I spoke with my family as well, but I pretty much knew that for me it was the right time to think about family and settling down. Okay,
so part of this podcast is about life beyond the uniform, so we've kind of got that stage now where you've decided to hang up the RAF uniform. So what was that like transitioning? Did you find it pretty straightforward because you had a new challenge ahead of you, or did you find there was a period of almost like decompression where everything was different, routine was different, pressure different? How did that feel?
Yeah, well, I'd be very truthful. I mean, I knew that I wanted to come home, but I was coming home for, I suppose, more personal reasons, in that I wanted to spend more time with family, less professional. I didn't really give career or what to do next much thought, apart from that I knew I wanted to do, well, it was actually, that's not true. During my resettlement, I obviously got to do some courses with a mixture of people, and a couple of young army guys actually inspired me to know that I wanted to do something that supported others transitioning or who had transitioned from the armed forces, who who I might have some skills that could help with their journey. So, but it was very broad. I didn't know what that really looked like. And then when I came back and had moved in, Coleraine Veterans Club were looking for somebody to help them grow what the club did, and I started my journey, I guess, into the Veteran Support Network there.
From there. Did you find for you the transition support that you received in terms of the last couple of days in uniform, that now you're out of the system and sort of settling into, inverted commas, civilian society? Were you happy that transition was what you needed, or were there any gaps that you felt, you know what, I don't know how to answer that, or I don't know where to get that information?
I suppose because I decided in Canada, and I had another couple of years left to serve before I retired. In that period of time, an opportunity came up to go to Iraq, so I went away for 18 months and then came home and I was done. So I pseudo left from there, as opposed to a normal transition out of a UK-based job, which I think would be the preferred option for people. But for me, that was okay. For me and my circumstances, that was okay. It worked. Okay. Yeah, it worked. Yeah. It worked really well, actually.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned then you got connected with the veterans group quite quickly. Yeah. So how did that help? Do you think being able to sort of step back in that environment where, maybe just the environment was what you're more used to, with sort of maybe the conversation, the attitudes of people, life values and all of that in that veterans group? Was that helpful, do you think?
Yeah, I learned an awful lot about the army very, very quickly.
Yeah. Hopefully all good.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's a different podcast, is it? A different podcast, yeah. But,
I guess it was still that I've been working in that world now for 5 years. And I think in that time I have learned an awful lot about the different journeys that different veterans have. And where there are, areas where I can help and support, and where I can get help and support from, if and when I need it. I think it could be quite disparate. So helping people kind of connect the dots and helping getting people plugged into the right places. But 100%, any of those clubs, any of the breakfast clubs, gardening clubs, beekeeping clubs, they all have that same flavour, and you see so many people connected into the right one for them, and they're back in that camaraderie, that sense of belonging, that moment of whatever else is going on for them.
Yeah, they can relax a bit. They can relax a bit. But you're currently working with Ashes to Gold. Just explain what that organisation does.
So Ashes to Gold is a Coleraine-based charity, and their aim is to restore a life's purpose, working predominantly with people living across Causeway Coast and Glens, Borough Council area, not just veterans or members of the Armed Forces community. They work with the local community too. They also deliver the Defence Garden Scheme, and then we're recently at Murbrook Lodge, which is where I work. I look after the whole site of Murbrook. We ran a Veterans Foundation funded project called the Giants Retreat, which did where we delivered activity-based wellbeing breaks for families. I had done some work in some other groups, and I think one of the things that we identified was that there's not a lot of respite opportunity in Northern Ireland, particularly supported, where there's somebody else around. There is elsewhere that people can go to. So we ran that project, and we also, we work with Coleraine Veterans Club supporting beekeeping and other bits and pieces. But the project or the charity itself, works with other groups too.
To deliver that, So you're clearly someone who is driven. I think that's clear from your multiple different roles, different jobs, and you embrace that change and that challenge. So what difference do you believe you're making, or that you're trying to make through your current role?
So through Ashes to Gold is about where there is developing solutions, or where there's gaps to support. And I guess that's the same with the Serving in Ex-Serving Women's Network, where there is a gap, trying to corral the resources to plug some of that gap in working in partnership with the rest of the network, so that things aren't sitting in isolation on their own. Okay,
so kind of moving towards an end of this, leadership. We mentioned it earlier. If you were to describe what you have learnt as a leader, or what areas you have developed as a leader, what would you point to?
I think the best leaders that I've ever worked for or with are innately curious about people and genuinely interested in people, and in how to inspire people to be the very best that they can. And I think at its core, that's what leadership's all about. And being able to carry that same line through a variety of different environments and different challenges is where the key, I guess, to good leadership. But being innately curious about people watching the whole way through, I think is what makes good leadership and inspires good followership.
I think that's a great answer. It's a great answer. Sometimes leadership, people think it's all about them and what they do, but it's interesting you've immediately identified that good leadership is about seeing those, particularly those that are under your leadership, understanding what makes them tick, understanding their perception of the situation of life and a view, and then adopting your leadership decision making to that. No, that's a very interesting
100%.
answer. Okay.
100%.
In terms of a young lady considering a career in the RAF, what would you say to them?
Oh, go for it. Go seize the opportunities that's there, and make the very most of it.
Mm-hmm. Any one story that stands out, sort of humorous, even during your time in uniform, something that you sort of conversation you have when you're back in a veterans group, or back with your friends years later, and they go, "Do you remember the time?" There must be something.
Yeah, I've got a few.
The ones that can be told on a public podcast would be preferable.
When I was in the Falklands then was, the fresh fruit and veg came down on the boat, so you didn't see it. It came in on the plane. Most of the food came in the boat. The days could be long, and you got a BFBS tape, with a couple of episodes of EastEnders that were several weeks out of date. So family members and friends would have sent down care packages, and this one friends of my parents sent me down a care package that included a self-inflating whoopee cushion.
Right, okay.
Now, in my office, there was my desk and the warrant officer's desk, and we had across from us there was, the soft seats you'd find in most messes with the lift-up cushion.
Yeah.
So the whoopee cushion lived there, and for weeks it was hilarious. We passed the time. You can imagine.
I can imagine. That's actually,
But it got to the point where everybody was aware of it, so nobody sat on the seat. They all sat on the arms. We completely forgot about it. And at one time, my two bosses above me wanted to come and talk to me about some paperwork issue on the flight. And as he came into the office, we were going to go and walk around and look at some aircraft too. I said, "You would like to walk around and look at the aircraft or talk about this first?" And he lowered himself down onto the chair and said, "I'd like to talk about the paperwork first."
And off it went.
The cushion was still there.
Off it went. And what was your explanation for that?
I didn't even get a chance for an explanation. I couldn't not laugh. He paused, then I think realised or hoped what it was, got up, walked out, went to see the in-between boss, says, "I just don't know what you do with her," and left.
That is one. That would be a good one to have caught on camera. For sure,
Now, many years later, I met the same man, and we were in America working on different jobs in a similar project, and I had a lovely meal with him and his wife, so he forgave me, I think.
I can just see the headline of that short, Jen Robinson whoopee cushion.
Yeah.
It's going to be the short on social media.
The story went around quite quickly.
I can imagine.
You didn't need social media.
Yeah, you're probably a hero off that though. You're doing your right like you're a hero. Okay, so last question. Let's say that in 2-3 generations from now, some young RAF women are looking at this podcast. How would you want to be remembered?
How would I want to be remembered? As somebody whose story's always continually evolving, I go next in September. I'm going to start training as a psychologist and hopefully bring everything that I've learnt up until now, both as in service and working in the veterans community, into another, lifetime where I can hopefully help prepare people for some of the inevitable challenges of life in the military. And that sort of continued commitment to people, because it's all about people at the end of the day. Whether you man the machine or the machine supports the man, it's about people. And I'd like to be remembered as that, I think. Excellent.
Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure doing this sort of interview, unpicking a bit about your journey. One thing's for sure, if I'm ever invited to your office, I'm not going to sit in a seat. I'll just stay standing in case there's a whoopee cushion hiding somewhere. But look, it's an absolute pleasure. And just on behalf of the Veterans Commissioner Office here in Northern Ireland, I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
An absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.